rather tragic and perhaps slightly comical story of the marriage of the Prince of Wales, future George IV. So finally, when the money was getting scarce, he decided to concede to the wishes of his father and the parliament and find himself a proper German Protestant princess to marry. From what we know, he gave the request to find a suitable candidate to one of his mistresses, Countess of Jersey, and you may ask yourself, if you were a royal mistress, who would you choose? What characteristics would you look for in the future queen? And of course, probably somebody who would not be much of a rival to your position as the royal mistress. And this was the line of thinking of the Countess of Jersey. So she found a princess who was suitably young. She was Protestant. Her name was Caroline of Brunswick, and she recommended her to be the royal bride. The prince didn't care so much at that point, but so he agreed. But then Caroline of Brunswick came to Britain for the wedding to be performed and to live as the Princess of Wales. And now the troubles start, because for all his excess weight and other problems, George was a very fashionable man. He was very particular about his clothes, about the perfume. He loved perfume. He was quite an educated and quite a civilized person. One good thing about him, he loved the novels of Jane Austen, so much so that she dedicated one of them to him. So he was a cultured man, quite sophisticated in his tastes, but Caroline wasn't. So when he saw her first, he didn't like her one bit. He didn't like the clothes that she was wearing. He objected. There is a story that she actually smelled, and she objected to the body odor that she had. Well, we do not know. Perhaps she didn't care for hygiene so much. Perhaps she was straight from the boat and did not prepare herself accordingly. Anyway, this was dislike at the first sight, so the opposite of love at the first sight. But anyway, they had to go through with the marriage. There is again a story that George wasn't sober. He just drank all evening, and after the ceremony he continued drinking until he collapsed on the floor. Some say he actually collapsed inside into the fireplace, which was luckily for him cold at that time, and this was clear that this marriage was not going to be happy. But somehow or other, probably during this disastrous wedding night, they managed to conceive a child. And 9 months later, a daughter was born who was given her grandmother's name, Charlotte. And this was the moment when both the prince and princess decided they've had enough. They basically separated, they lived apart. George continued with his mistresses. Caroline had her own separate court and possibly also took lovers. But because they had the daughter, and the little Princess Charlotte was described by everybody as the darling of England. Some say she was the first royal celebrity. Before Victoria, before Diana, before all the royal celebrities, there was Princess Charlotte. Pretty, blonde, smart, funny, everybody loved her. And she was, of course, the next in line, because in England, unlike on the continent, the daughters could also inherit the crown. So yes, there was going to be the queen after George III and after George IV. When Charlotte was around 18, she was a healthy, strong, and quite robust young woman. There appeared the question that perhaps she should marry and find an appropriate husband and start a family of her own, so to continue the royal dynasty. And an appropriate husband was found. She actually chose him herself. She fell in love. He was very handsome. He was from the small German principality of Coburg. You may remember this name. This was a small principality that didn't have any riches in the world except one handsome princess. So the princely family of Coburg tried to position their sons anywhere where there was a queen or a future queen in need of a husband. So this prince called Leopold was believed by many to be the handsomest man in his generation. So when he took to his heart to win the hand of Princess Charlotte, he was successful. She fell in love. There was a fairy tale wedding, and soon enough Charlotte was pregnant. So everybody, the press especially, were extremely happy about the whole situation. But then disaster struck, and Charlotte gave birth to a son. So yes, everybody was very happy because the future of the dynasty seemed secure. But within a few days, she died of post-delivery complications. So this was a horrible tragedy. Like, 2 generations of future British monarchs died at the same time, and it was absolutely clear that George, then the Prince of Wales, the Prince Regent, and his wife, Princess Caroline, would not be producing any more children because for years and years they have not lived together. So what would Henry VIII do? Of course, he would divorce his wife, perhaps even have her beheaded, but anyway, take a new wife. So the Prince Regent believed, yes, I can do the same. I will divorce Caroline on the grounds of infidelity, her infidelity, of course. His own did not matter here, and look for another wife and produce some more children. This wasn't an obvious case because he was guess he was pushing 50 at that time, and his health was failing, not to mention his size. So yes, this wasn't so certain that he would be able to have any more children. But the first thing he wanted to do was to divorce Caroline. And the only way to divorce at the beginning of the 19th century until the middle of the 19th century, which is, as you may remember, the parliamentary divorce. So the 2 houses of parliament would have to pass an act regarding an individual, in this case a royal, marriage. So both the Prince Regent and the Princess had to be questioned by the parliament, and of course, since the ground for the divorce was supposed to be Caroline's infidelity, it had to be proven before the parliament. And here there is a difference between the times of Henry VIII and the future George IV. And this difference is that in the 19th century, the press and the public opinion had more to say than the parliament. So the press, quite surprisingly, but maybe not so much, took the side of Caroline. The idea was that she was the wronged woman. She never wanted to be royal. She was invited into this marriage. She was neglected and cheated by the prince. So she was the wrong party. She couldn't be considered the party to be blamed for the divorce. So eventually, after a very humiliating trial for both, but especially for the prince, the parliament decided not to grant them the divorce. So, especially that Caroline did not want the divorce because she believed that when the old king dies, she would be the next Queen of England. And both the public opinion, especially the women readers, and the parliament said that she had the right for it, and definitely that the prince should not be granted his divorce. So this is the moment when the public opinion and the middle class, because the middle class were mostly the readers of the newspapers, decide on the matters of the private life of the future monarch. So this is something unprecedented. And within a few years, George III was dead, and the Prince Regent had to be crowned as George IV. There was the last act to this drama when Caroline tried to storm into Westminster Abbey and demand to be crowned the Queen of England. And George, who orchestrated a very splendid coronation, he adored, he was a fan of Napoleon. He believed that he himself defeated Napoleon. Of course he didn't, but it was the English army under the leadership of Wellington. But anyway, towards the end of his life, George believed that he crushed Napoleon, and when he was to be crowned king, he wanted his coronation to be almost exact copy of the coronation of Napoleon, which was very splendid. Anyway, it was all happening at Westminster Abbey, and Caroline arrived, but she was not admitted through the door. The door was actually closed in front of her face, and her protestations did not amount to much, so she was turned away. Unfortunately for her, and possibly for many other people, very soon afterwards she fell ill. Some say she was ill already. She was suffering from something, perhaps cancer, perhaps some other grave disease. And within 2 weeks of this disastrous and very humiliating coronation that never happened for her, she was dead. So once again, the British public opinion took her side, and her funeral became a state occasion. She wanted to be buried in her native native Duchy of Brunswick, and she asked for her coffin to be equipped with a plaque reading Caroline of Brunswick, the injured Queen of England. So that's the end of the story. I will give you the link to a BBC film, a kind of docudrama called The Royal Scandal, that tells this story. So if you want to see the kind of dramatized version of it, you'll have the chance. And the last part in a moment will be about William IV. George IV and William IV were called by the Victorian historians as the wicked uncles, the uncles, of course, of Queen Victoria. So George, you can see why he was quite unpopular, and beside Charlotte, who died tragically young, he didn't have any children, even the illegitimate ones, so he never had children with his mistresses. Unlike his younger brother, the Duke of York, William, who might be seen as a proponent of the new style of family life. He was a very devoted father to his 10 children, none of whom were legitimate. He had a long-standing relationship with a comical actress. Her name was Dorothy Jordan. They had 10 children together. They all had the name of Fitzroy, which was a traditional name of the royal bastards. But of course, being bastards, even though the king, the future king, loved them very much and cared for them and tried to find good employment for them, they were, of course, not applicable to sit on the throne. So after Charlotte died, the younger brothers of the Prince Regent rushed to get married and to produce legitimate offspring. So sometimes long-standing relationships, like the relationship of William and Mrs. Jordan, had to be ended, and the princess had to look for eligible German Protestant princesses. So William chose a young German princess called Adelaide. She was quite a likable person, and she really tried to give him children, but for some reason none of these children survived infancy. They tried a few times. If the child survived delivery at all, they died when they were still infants. So when George IV died after 10 years of his reign in 1830, the next surviving member of the royal family, so the one to take the throne, was William, the Duke of York. And he would be a likable monarch for one thing. He lacked completely the kind of dignity that the British would associate with the king. He was sometimes called Billy the Sailor because he spent his youth in the Royal Navy. He was sometimes called Silly Billy because he was so informal and so completely devoid of dignity. He was not a party animal like the Prince of Wales, but he had this big illegitimate family which was perceived as a drain on the royal purse. So he ultimately was also quite unpopular for the fact that he could not produce legitimate offspring with his wife. He did not present himself in a dignified manner that would be associated with the royal status. So luckily for him, he had quite a stable political situation with Earl Grey, yes, the man after whom the tea was named, as the Prime Minister. So quite a lot of reforms, including the Great Reform Act of 1832, changing the system of the elections for the Parliament and including more people from the middle class into the voting rights. So it was quite obvious soon enough that he would not produce any more children, and if none of the babies he tried to produce with his wife survived, which was likely, the next in line would be the family of his younger brother, the Duke of Kent, Edward the Duke of Kent. He had a military career in his youth. He had a long-standing French mistress with whom he had to part after the death of Princess Charlotte and look for a German princess who happened to be the sister of this Leopold, the widowed now husband of Princess Charlotte, the man who wanted to be the informal king of England but never was, but who was by that time invited to the throne of a completely new state, that is Belgium. So now the sister to the future then king of the Belgians, called Victoria, or the French spelling of her name that she mostly used, Victoire, was chosen to be the wife of the Duke of Kent. She was a widow, she had 2 children by that time, so it was proven that she was able to have more children. And soon enough, within the first year of marriage, she was pregnant again. The family of the Duke of Kent rushed back to England so that the child would be born on English soil. They already understood that this child would be quite important in case the Yorks do not produce any offspring. And so Victoria was born as the daughter of the younger son of King George III. So after her 2 uncles, George and William, died finally, leaving no surviving offspring, Victoria was the next to sit on the throne. Why not her father? Because within the first 2 years of her life, he died. He caught a chill, it developed into pneumonia, and quite unexpectedly, he died when Victoria was still a toddler. So she was raised by her mother, who was in a very sharp conflict with the royal family, especially with her brother-in-law William. So much so that he told publicly at the dinner table when she was one of the guests that he wants to live long enough for Victoria to turn 18 so that she can sit on the throne without the need of another regency, because quite possibly her mother, the Duchess of Kent, would be the next regent. So this is how Victoria came to the throne. She came to the throne after decades of severe dynastic crisis, and this was well into the 19th century. She came to the throne in 1837. The middle class was a dominant social force, so to preserve the monarchy, she really needed to take her duties as the sovereign very, very seriously. We'll return to the history of the royal family later on when we when we discuss the 19th century, but for next week I would like to move one step back, or basically to the same period as the Regency, and talk about the Regency and also Romanticism, so another very important social, philosophical and artistic movement. That's it for this week. You'll get the link to the BBC film as well. And yeah, see you next week.